Here's something to keep an eye on tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. Before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York, the federal appeals court that sits in New York, there will be oral arguments in the case of Donald J. Trump and Donald J. Trump Jr. versus the Committee on Financial Services. This is the president trying to block Democrats in the House from getting his financial records. In April, two committees in the House subpoenaed Capital One and Deutsche Bank to gain access to financial records related to the president. The president's longtime personal attorney, Michael Cohen, had testified under oath that the president inflated his assets and lied about the value of things that he was in control of in order to secure bank loans or for insurance purposes. The way Michael Cohen described it, he said that those things could potentially amount to criminal bank fraud or criminal insurance fraud. Cohen's testimony led to those subpoenas by House Democrats in an effort to pry loose the president's financial information from his bank and his accounting firm to see if documents from those institutions might corroborate Cohen's allegations. Even since then, there have been more allegations of that kind. The Huffington Post is now reporting that the president filed financial disclosure statements that appear to misstate the value and profitability of his golf courses in Scotland by just a little bit, by just $165 million. He said in his American public filings that those properties were each worth more than $50 million. At the same time, he told authorities in the UK that those properties weren't worth anything like that. They were, in fact, $65 million in debt. Well, they could be either, but they can't be both. What's lurking in the president's financial and business records that Congress has been working so hard to get? I mean, that fight is on. It's this red-hot fight waged in large part by the president to try to keep anybody from knowing what's in his taxes or his financial records. So we'll see oral arguments in federal appeals court in New York tomorrow at 10 a.m. over whether or not Congress is going to be able to get Trump's bank records. And that's just one of the lawsuits the president has engaged in to try to stop Congress from getting his taxes and financial records. There's a whole bunch of them. But you know what? Whatever happens with all of those federal cases and his fights with Congress, President Trump has a whole nother thing on his hands when it comes to a totally different adversary and inquisitor: the New York State Attorney General. In March, New York Attorney General Letitia James subpoenaed Deutsche Bank for the Trump Organization's financial records, including those related to some of the schemes that Michael Cohen described in his testimony. Tish James is also leading an incredibly potent investigation right now into a key Trump political ally, the NRA. That's an investigation that has already plainly managed to freak out the NRA and its leadership. And just this week, Tish James launched a new lawsuit against the Trump administration over its recent immigration policies. What have you been doing with yourself this summer? Joining us now is New York State Attorney General Letitia James. Madam Attorney General, I'm really happy you're here. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know that summarizes only a tiny piece of what you and your office are doing right now, but that's just some of the stuff I've been trying to keep up with.
17 cases since I took office 8 months ago, one every 2 weeks.
Really?
Yes.
Tell me about the financial piece of this first. It has been interesting to me to watch the president fight tooth and nail. He hired a whole new raft of lawyers that are only trying to keep his taxes and financial information secret. And he's got a bear of a fight over that, both on his taxes and his financial documents with multiple committees in Congress. But he also seems to have a real fight with you on that. Can you tell us about the progress of that?
So, Rachel, before I get into the litigation, let me just tell you about who I am. And let me just set the table for you.
Please.
We are a country of laws and rules. And it's really critically important that we adhere to those laws and rules. And what guides me and my principles is I believe in equality, and I believe that the law should apply to all of us and that no one is above the law. Those are simple concepts and simple principles that I believe in. And I also believe that as the Attorney General of the great state of New York, that I cannot sit idly by and allow someone to basically subvert the United States Constitution or the Constitution of the great state of New York. And that explains all of the litigation that we've been involved in. We have a federal government which unfortunately has been engaged in retrenchment, a federal government which is basically closed. And so all of these lawsuits basically are defending the rights of immigrants, the rights of women, the disabled, the rights of individuals, their health care, the environment, and the list goes on and on and on. And if we, again, are to continue the progress that we have made in this nation, if we are to believe in the simple concepts of equality for all and justice for all, then you've got to fight back and you've got to stand up and you have to use the law both as a sword and as a shield. Getting to your question. So there are a number of investigations going on in our office as a result of the testimony of Michael Cohen. and they raise some legitimate concerns. Now, the President of the United States has complained that I'm engaging in some sort of political witch hunt, that I've got some personal vendetta against him, that I campaigned against him. That is not true. I've not politicized the office. Mr. Cohen raised some questions and some issues that I am obligated as the Attorney General of the state of New York to pursue. And so we are following the facts and the evidence. And some of these cases, unfortunately, I cannot divulge. I cannot give you a status and or update where they are. I can only tell you that the Office of Attorney General is standing up for the law. And again, no one is above the law, including the most powerful individual in this country, and that is the President of these United States.
On the financial issues in particular, one of the things that we can watch in those federal court fights that are happening between the president and various congressional committees is that we can see how the president filing individual lawsuits, the president employing the Justice Department in some cases to come in on his side in those lawsuits against Congress and them trying to act. We can sort of see how his legal strategy has stopped those inquiries or at least slowed them down for now. In terms of the way that he has fought you on these matters, do you feel that you have been stopped or that you have been diverted from anything that you're pursuing because of his work?
By no means. See, the President of the United States uses the lawsuits. He hides behind the law. And what we need is accountability and transparency. For instance, the Trust Act. The Trust Act was an act that was passed by the New York State Legislature, which basically says that the three committees in the United States Congress can ask for the President's tax records in the state of New York, his state taxes. And so we're in litigation right now because the president individually and personally filed a lawsuit against me, the Ways and Means Committee of Congress, as well as New York State Taxation and Finance, basically blocking his taxes. And as you know, Rachel, every president has offered up their taxes, their state and their federal taxes, but not this president. Why shouldn't the law apply to him? Why shouldn't he be held accountable? Why shouldn't he provide transparency to the millions of individuals who would like to see his taxes?
Let me ask you, and I reckon this is a naive question, and you can tell me I'm dumb for asking it.
I would never do that.
I might deserve it sometime. Don't rule it out. But on that last point that you were just making about this New York state law that says, under certain circumstances, a person's state, the president's state tax returns could be handed over to the appropriate members of Congress. If that gets to the end of the line in terms of the president trying to sue you and trying to block that in courts and trying to fight that out through litigation, and the president just decides, you know what, I'm going to flout that law. What's New York going to do? Arrest me? I mean, where does that end if the president decides that's a state law and he just doesn't feel bound by it, even if he loses in the courts?
So the reality is we are fighting this case, one, because it was filed in the District of Columbia, and we believe that New York is not subject to the jurisdiction of the District of Columbia, and that case should be heard here in New York. And two, he is arguing that this Trust Act, which would, again, reveal his state taxes, is in violation of the First Amendment, and that somehow we are retaliating against him because of his political views, and nothing can be further from the truth. If, in fact, he loses, and right now the case is being held up until we resolve these jurisdictional issues, if we win, and if Chairman Neal of Ways and Means request his state taxes in furtherance of congressional responsibilities and duties, then we will turn over those state taxes. And so Chairman Neal has yet to ask us, and so it's really premature to bring this lawsuit, and I'm confident that his lawsuit against me, against Taxation and Finance, and against Chairman Neal will be dismissed because it is premature.
There's one other matter that I want to ask you about. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, you appear to be driving the National Rifle Association to distraction right now with your investigation that involves potentially their nonprofit status. I'd like to ask you about that when we come back. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.